Everyone thinks siliconing is hard to do, but in today's video I'm going to show you how, with the right tools, you'll realise that it really isn't. In this video you'll find a comprehensive list of the do's and the don'ts, so by the end of the video you will have everything you need to know and you'll know all the tools that you need to buy to silicone like a true pro. Siliconing can be a bit of a minefield with lots of competing views on how it should and shouldn't be done. That's why I've got my list of do's and don'ts. And at the end of the video, I'm going to be re-siliconing my shower area with all of its uneven tiles, corners and transverse joints. So you get to see just how easy it is to do, even in quite a tricky area like this. So let's have a look at the tools featured in today's video. We've got this Everbuild Sealant strip out tool, and we've got a Stanley knife and a scraper here. And to degrease the joint we've got some methylated spirits. We've then got the silicone applicator gun here, two different forms of silicone, clear silicone 781 from Dow Corning and Mapesil, which is a coloured silicone available in lots of different colours. Great when you're trying to match the silicone to the grout. And last but not least, the most important thing in the kit is Fujikit silicone profiling tool from Kramer. Full details of all today's tools will be available in the description at the end of the video. So to demonstrate my list of things that you should avoid doing when you're siliconing, I've prepared this handy little mock-up here. So I'm saying don't use tape, don't use your finger, don't shape the silicone in a concave profile, don't use water and detergent, don't cut the nozzle really small at 45 degrees, or pull the nozzle along the joint. And if you can, although this isn't completely essential, try not to cover all three sides of the joint. Now, these little tips might surprise a lot of you out there. It certainly surprised me when I went from a sort of amateur DIY siliconer in my teens to having fully researched the process and come up with the best possible solution for doing it. So let's have a look at what you shouldn't do in practice. So, when I first started siliconing, I used to get some electrical tape like this, and I would put it around the joint. I thought this was absolute genius because it's guaranteeing me a really straight edge. I then cut the nozzle really small like this at 45 degrees, my thinking being it gave you a much tighter, neater bead. And then I'd apply silicone into the joint like this, pulling the silicone along the joint as I went. I'd then take my finger and I'd smooth the silicone along the insulating tape like this. And then I'd peel off the tape leaving what appears to be a beautiful clean joint. Right, there are a number of problems with this technique. The first one is, although you've got a nice clean line along here, you've immediately got a point almost like a lip here, a step, where you get bacteria forming. And once you get bacteria forming, that is a breeding ground for mildew, dirt and soap. And it won't be long before you have to replace this silicone bead. That's point one. Point two, by using your finger, again your finger is a source of bacteria, which again is going to lead to mould and mildew forming on the silicone. The third problem with using your finger or any forming tool that has a concave profile like this is that you're creating a very, very thin, weak bead of silicone. Now if I show you on this side profile here, the bead itself is almost non-existent. It's not going to take much flexing of that joint, as can happen, for the silicone to crack. Point two, when somebody cleans this joint, very quickly this very micro thin layer of silicone is going to start being scratched away. When the silicone's set, you can rub this thin bead really easily and it'll start to come away from the surface. As I'll be showing you later in the video, with a diagonal joint or even a convex joint, you're creating a bead of silicone that is over 8 times stronger than this very thin joint you've got here. By drawing the silicone or pulling it along the joint as I'm doing here, you're not forcing it into the joint and you're giving the silicone an opportunity to form gaps between the side of the joint and the silicone. Now this joint I've just done here, which hasn't been tooled yet, looks pretty good, but you can see a little bit of a gap there. And it may be you're restricted behind a tap or something, so you can't get that close, and you might end up sort of producing an effect similar to this here. Now you see there, I mean that's a very obvious gap. but you've also got these gaps all the way along the bead of silicone. Now, typically when I've produced a bead of silicone in the past, I've taken my finger or a forming tool and smoothed it almost straight away. And in this situation, you're going to be closing off most of those gaps, so you've not really got too much of a problem. Although I'll be showing you later on in the video a much better way to apply the silicone into that joint, such that you don't get those gaps. But this is where my video becomes a little bit controversial. A lot of trade pros out there use a water detergent mix as a tooling agent, and they apply it at this point before they've actually smoothed the silicone. I had a guy commenting on my last silicone video and he got very angry and said I was a complete amateur because I wasn't using this water detergent mix. My point is this. The whole point of this water and detergent mix is to create a slippery, greasy surface that the silicone can't grab onto. So in our example here, I'm going to spray the bead as you often would, and we've now created a surface that's so slippery, look, silicone just doesn't form on it. No matter how much you try, you cannot get the silicone to stick. Why do siliconers use this mix? Because it makes tooling the silicone really easy for them once they've applied the bead. But look here, you've just seen how slippery the surface is, and now all of this detergent and water has gone behind those gaps that I showed you in the silicone bead a minute ago. So now when we smooth this bead, even though it might on the face of it look okay, there for example, you can see what a potential nightmare we've already got happening here. We've got very obvious gaps here behind the silicone bead, and that joint is going to be absolutely hopeless and is going to start leaking almost immediately. Now my last point in this section of things not to do is not quite so important, but the established wisdom on this is that you shouldn't really cover all three corners of the joint with silicone. Now the reason for this is that if your joints have got a bit of movement in them, and possibly you're using a high modulus, i.e. a stiff silicone, then by adhering to all three sides of the joint, if there's any movement, the silicone can start tearing pretty easily. But out of all the tips I've given you in this section, this is the one I would say I'm least worried about, because you may not have a lot of movement in your joint, and it's more relevant really where, as you see in some joints, there's a gap here between the wall and the shower tray or whatever it is, in which case you often see a foam filler piece being applied, and where you do that, it's much easier just to have it adhering to, say, to two sides of the joint there and there. It's not so easy to do that where, like here, in my situation, you've got a nice clean joint with no gaps underneath it. But you know, if you are worried about this, then you could select a low modulus silicone, which is a more flexible silicone, which will be much more accommodating and flexible if there is a bit of movement between your walls and, say, your shower tray. I know we're 7.5 minutes into the video. I hope I've still got you all, because this is the really cool bit now where I unveil my 12 golden tips for achieving the perfect silicone joint. Okay, I'm going to go through each of my 12 golden rules in turn, and don't worry if you don't catch them first off, because they'll be repeated in the description at the end of this video. Now, clearly the first rule of siliconing is to make sure your joints are well prepared, by which I mean excess silicone has been removed and the joint has been properly degreased. Dealing firstly with the removal of existing silicone, to the extent you've got to do that, I find these Stanley blades inserted onto a scraper like this particularly useful. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable using a scraper like this, there are other tools on the market, such as this, which are designed to help you scrape the silicone out of the joint. For the sake of completeness, I should also mention that there are a lot of sealant removers on the market. I don't actually feature a silicone remover in this video, but I'll post some details of examples in the description at the end of the video. Now, I've seen a lot of people on forums saying, can I silicone over existing silicone? And the answers are pretty mixed. You know, some people say yes, of course you can, some people say of course you can't. You've got to remove all the silicone to do a proper job. Now, my advice on this generally is, where you can, I would remove the existing silicone. However, if, like me in your bathroom, you've got pretty clean joints like this, where the silicone has actually been piped into a gap between the tile and the shower tray, so it's not really that proud of the surface, and you can get a bead on top of it pretty well, I wouldn't worry too much about removing the silicone. I'm not going to be able to remove the silicone, partly because I've got an acrylic shower tray, so it's going to damage it if I start scraping away at the silicone, but also because the silicone has, as I say, been piped so well into the joint, it's not necessary to remove it. Now, in terms of siliconing onto existing silicone, there's 2 points to make here. Point one, as I said in the previous section of this video, you don't actually want the silicone to knit onto all 3 corners of the joint. You only really want about 2-3 millimeters on the side and then 2 or 3 millimeters on the base. Provided your new silicone joint has that crucial 2 to 3 millimeter bond on the side and on the base of whatever you're siliconing to, if it hasn't bonded to the silicone in the middle, it's doing you a bit of a favour because it's less likely to tear should you have a bit of flexibility in your joints. But a little bit of advice for you here. If you want to do something and you can't find any examples on forums about whether it works or it doesn't, try it out for yourself to see what happens. Here's what I mean. So I was intrigued to know whether you can silicone onto existing silicone. So that's exactly what I've done here. As you can see now, here the silicone is dried onto the existing silicone, and I'm now going to try and remove it so that I can show you how well it's adhered. And as you can see, we've got a really good bond there. I'm probably going to do a separate video on this, but I just want to make the point very quickly to you. This silicone, the existing silicone bead here, has been in the shower for about 1.5 years. I haven't really degreased this particularly well, I've just given it a quick clean, and I cannot scrape off the new silicone from that existing silicone bead. So for those of you out there who want to know whether you can or can't silicone, try it out yourself, and in my case the answer is a pretty categorical yes, you can. Degreasing. As I've said, you can use acetone or methylated spirits to degrease. I personally have chosen methylated spirits. I think it's more readily available than acetone and it's a less abrasive degreasing agent. The good thing about either of these degreasing agents is you apply it to the joint, you know it's really beautifully degreased that joint, and then the methylated spirits evaporates off, leaving you a perfect surface to silicone onto. Golden rule number 2. Make sure you buy the right silicone for your joints. This is often overlooked at this point. People just go out and buy any old tube of silicone. Silicone is generally categorised like this one as medium/high modulus. These silicones are basically quite rigid and inflexible. These are good for joints that you don't think are going to have a lot of movement, where you're going to be cleaning them and you want them to be tough to withstand the cleaning. Low modulus silicone is a much more flexible silicone, which would be really appropriate, for example, around a bath. You may have heard the old trick that when you're sealing around a bath, you should fill the bath with water for your silicone, because the bath naturally sags down a bit with the weight of the water in it if, for example, it's on a wooden floor. If you don't do that, the chances are when you run the bath, the silicone's going to flex, and if it's a very inflexible high modulus silicone, you might find it tears and then you get the water coming in. So it's a quick and simple point, but one you must observe. Golden rule number 3, go and buy yourself one of these. It's a Fuji kit from Kramer. It's a silicone profiling tool. £12, roughly $15. You cannot go wrong. I think this is one of the best profiling tools in the market. Now, the brilliant thing about these little tools is a releasing agent. The water and detergent that we talked about a few moments ago is not necessary. Don't take my word for it, it's here in the instructions itself. So you can throw this away. There's lots of variations on the market, but this one comes in this handy little kit. Just having a quick look at some of the tools we've got here. This is the original Fuji. You've got 4 angles around the edge, a large concave angle there, and you've got 16 10mm and a 90-degree angle there. You've then got the ability to make smaller beads here, and there's a cunning little tool here for transverse joints that I'll be showing you shortly. This little tool here is great for getting into restricted spaces like taps. And finally, we've got this Fuji 2 tool here, which is fantastic because you put this attachment on it for getting across tricky transverse joints whilst maintaining a continuous bead. And just look at the strength of this diagonal joint compared with the concave joint I did earlier with some electrical tape on my finger. So I'm now going to run through golden rules 4 to 12 as I tackle the re-siliconing of my shower. Okay, so we've now got the perfect silicone profiling tool, but we're now going to work out what size angle to use. And you do that by going around the bathroom or whatever it is you're siliconing, look for the biggest gap you've got, and then select the smallest tool for that gap, plus 2 to 3 millimeters each side. So here in my bathroom, I'm going to use the Fuji 2 tool because I've got these transverse joints to negotiate here. Here is a slightly troublesome joint I've got here where there's been a bit of water leaking out, and it's between the 8 and the 10mm tool. I'm going to go with the 10mm to be absolutely sure I get a really good joint. Now, this is where in my video I depart from what you're often told to do on silicone instruction videos. I've chosen the 10mm profiling tool, and I'm going to cut the silicone nozzle to 10mm, i.e. the exact width of the profiling tool. This means that the bead that I'm applying to the joint pretty much matches the profiling tool. The other thing I'm going to do here, which is pretty surprising, is I'm cutting the nozzle at 90 degrees, not 45 degrees as you would typically expect. Cutting the nozzle to the same diameter as the profiling tool means that the bead that comes out of the silicone is compatible with the profiling tool, so there's not going to be too much wastage. But also, cutting the nozzle at 90 degrees means that we are encouraging ourselves to force the silicone into the joint rather than pulling or dragging, which is what you're more inclined to do if the nozzle's cut at 45 degrees. See, by doing it like this, I'm forcing the silicone into the joint. That way I know there won't be any gaps. Now, the other thing about this tool is you're encouraged to work in short sections. As you pull the tool along, you want to make sure that you're keeping the tool in contact with the wall on both sides. And then, to the extent you can see a little bit of excess silicone, like here, you can just go back over the area, removing that excess silicone. I'm going to be using the grey sealant along this joint. So what I've done here is I'm just smoothing with this tool round the corner, working out from both edges away from the vertical joint. Which is so brilliant, this tool, because if you've got any excess like I've got there, you can simply just wipe it away. No need for the special attachment this time, I'm just going to use the original Fuji. Working in short sections because you simply don't need to do the whole run in one go. Then I'm just going to trim around the corner to get that lovely clean edge. So, I really hope you found this video useful. My advice to you, if you've got your own silicone job to do, is go out and buy one of these kits and get practicing. Practice makes perfect. And the beautiful thing about these tools is you can have a bit of a go, and if you're not completely pleased with the finish you've got, you can just scrape it off and start again. As ever, it'd be great to get your comments or questions at the end of this video, and if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here.